At their heart, the Souls games have always been about risk, reward, and punishment. However, unlike many games, where success is determined by reaction time and gamer speed, the Souls games have always favored rewarding and punishing players for their levels of awareness. A player who successfully and cautiously observes their surroundings and their enemies will be rewarded with information that allows them to successfully defeat their enemies and navigate dungeons while taking a minimum amount of damage in return. However, a gamer who recklessly or carelessly rushes forward into a dungeon or encounter will regularly find themselves taking extra damage or dying as punishment for their lack of respect for their environment. Now, I'm not going to speak more on the pros and cons of trial and error gameplay, as VaatiVidya already did a very good discussion of that in his video A Tale of Two Gamers. If you haven't reviewed that already, then I highly suggest it, and I'll leave a link in the description. Suffice it to say, though, that the core philosophies of the Souls series have always been awareness, observation, and learning. And as I played through Dark Souls 2, I was pleased to see that those philosophies were well carried out throughout most of the game. However, there were some things that I noticed and continued to notice that started to bother me. Taking damage when I didn't think I had earned it. Enemies behaving in a way that I hadn't come to expect based on prior observations. And I began to wonder if these things were bugs or were actually conscious design decisions. So the purpose of this video was to take a look at some of these issues in action and see how they affect the gameplay. And from there we can examine whether we think that they're bugs or design decisions, and whether they need to be brought to the developers. To say, in your game, you've taught us that I can expect this, however in these situations, something else has happened. And because of that, I've taken damage or been punished for something that I couldn't reasonably be expected to have avoided. It's important to note that I'm not concerned with bugs or obvious glitches. These are clear errors in coding that result in unintended and sometimes hilarious consequences for the player or enemies. For example, if you spend a great deal of time fighting the Smelter Demon, or if you are aware of a certain YouTuber's Dark Souls 2 video series, then you may already be aware of this bug and aware of how frequently it can occur. Here, as the Smelter Demon recovers from his leap attack and transitions into a new animation, it's possible for him to eject the player across the arena, causing them to become stuck in the wall geometry and completely unable to recover. This is especially problematic in the case of cooperative summons, because one player is then taken out of the fight, and the other player is left with a buffed up boss and no support. However, as I indicated before, bugs aren't a particular concern because they're obviously errors. These aren't things that we can expect to see in future games, and in the present ones we can hope they'll get patched out. Instead, for the purposes of this video, what I want to focus on are things that are potentially bugs, but also potentially design decisions, and that's where we need to be concerned. The first of these is unpredictable attack deflection. And this typically occurs when you perform a thrusting attack against a normal-sized humanoid enemy. Did you see it? Let's take a look again. Now you may have noticed that my targeting reticle was active the whole time, and the only action performed was a simple R2. Based on that, what should have happened is my character should have stabbed forward with the claymore, trading damage directly with the Black Dragon Knight. However, what actually happened was as my attack started, my character turned about 20 degrees to the side and simply missed. Now, in case you think this is a fluke, you'll find that this is actually very easily replicated by using thrusting attacks on any of the Black Dragon Knights in Dragon Shrine, regardless of their stance or what weapons they're using. Another problem is that this phenomenon isn't limited to the Black Dragon Knights in Dragon Shrine, and that's, I think, because of what you see right here. As the attack deflects, sometimes they can take damage, and the reason that I believe that this became so apparent with the Black Dragon Knights is because of most of the humanoid mobs, they are the ones with the highest health and are most likely to survive the attack. Instead, let's take a look at the mannequins in Earthen Peak at the central bonfire. Now, as you see here, the deflection animation can still occur. However, because the enemy took damage and died, I believe it's more likely that players write this off as a simple damage trade and don't think more of it. As with the Black Dragon Knights, you also see that this action can be pretty easily replicated. And that's what bothers me about this. It doesn't make it clear whether this was a bug or a flaw in the design or an actual design decision. And if it is a design decision, it doesn't seem to make sense nor fit with the philosophy of awareness, as there's no way for me to predict how or why or when this is going to happen. And that brings us to another concern, and one that does appear to be an actual design decision on the part of the developers. And if you know where I am, then you can probably predict what's coming. Yes, the two-handed mace Drakekeepers. When I'm talking to newer players about strategies for approaching enemies in Dark Souls, one of the things that I like to give them as a guideline is the rule of 3. If an enemy can perform one melee attack, he can probably perform up to 3. Now, this doesn't always hold the case, as some can perform more or less, but in the end you get the idea. You need to watch for an enemy's moves and understand if they can follow up with another attack and what an actual recovery looks like. However, as we watch the Drakekeeper, there is very rarely anything approaching a recovery. In fact, he only has one attack that really shows some form of recovery, and that's his long overhead smash, which you can see here. But you'll notice that it doesn't actually have a recovery. The only weakness is that it's a very slow attack and gives you time to respond. Also, most mobs can only perform a few attacks before they have to recover, almost as if they had endurance. But let's count the Drakekeepers. And this brings me to a short discussion about balance. Now, in a game where there are multiple valid playstyles, in the case of Dark Souls, magic, melee, and ranged, it's important that, for the purposes of fun gameplay, that each of those styles be at least reasonably balanced. While it's okay for some enemies to be easier for magic or easier for melee, it's not appropriate to have enemies or a series of enemies that would be, for example, completely resistant to magic and completely negating that playstyle. So when I talk about balance, I like to point to the example of the Knight Artorias fight from the Dark Souls 1 DLC. For me, this is the perfect example of a technical and expertly balanced fight for all playstyles. For melee, Artorias was relentless, punishing, but he also had clear recoveries, albeit short, where the player could sneak in and reliably get damage, and then sneak back out again. For magic users, Artorias was able to close distance quickly, but his animations were long enough that they allowed mages to sneak away from him and reliably cast spells before he could close with them again. Because of this, I think Artorias represents the proper example of balance that games really need to strive for, and because it was such a fun but difficult fight, approaching this bonfire for the first time for me was one of my favorite achievements in Dark Souls 1. Now contrast that with the example of our Drake Keeper. At no point in his animation does he give any indication that it is safe for a melee character to sneak in and try and apply damage without the expectation that they're going to have to take damage in return. However, lack of reasonable opportunity to attack isn't the only problem with the Drake Keepers. They have a more concerning animation that shows up twice in this video, and I apologize if you're watching on YouTube, it would be very hard to see. But it's an animation stutter, and I've observed it on these guys most, but also on the old knights in Heights Tower, and more concerningly on Veldstad the Royal Aegis. One of the things that I tell people I like about Dark Souls is that it's not particularly twitchy, at least not on the levels of a Ninja Gaiden or a Street Fighter. In this game, when you perform an action, you're locked into the animation until that animation ends. However, if you watch the Drake Keeper, and you look for that animation stutter, it appears that they may not be bound by the same rules as the player. In slow motion, watch as he recovers from this swing, and as he lifts it up, it appears that he skips several frames of animation from the recovery, allowing him to attack more quickly. And in a game that relies heavily on timing, recovery, and opportunity as part of the combat system, any enemy that can skip out of their recovery or shorten it in any way is inconsistent with the philosophy of the game. I'd like to talk for a few minutes about unblockable attacks. Now, love them or hate them, unblockable attacks have been a part of gaming for a long time, and as long as they're handled appropriately, that's usually not a problem. What do I mean by appropriate? Unblockable attacks should always be easily identified. They should be well telegraphed, and it should be reasonable for the player to be able to avoid them. And for this I like to point to the Pursuer's Curse Blade. As you can see here, it's very well telegraphed and slow building, and it also has a very clear blue animation to indicate that this is something the player wants to avoid. Now let's compare that to the two-handed sword-wielding Drake Keepers. As part of their regular melee animation, they have a two-handed overhead attack. They perform this at the beginning of most of their combos. What's odd about this attack is that it completely bypasses shields, and there's no reason for the player or indication to the player as to why this would happen. One might reasonably argue that this is because of the sheer size and mass of the Drake Keepers, as well as their height, which gives them a Z-axis advantage. This causes their sword to pass over the shield of the player. And I could accept these arguments if it couldn't be demonstrated to the contrary. Now, in this fight, I'm going to position the other Drake Keeper so that I gain the Z-axis advantage by drawing him down the stairs. And you can see here now I'm positioning myself higher up on the stairs so that I can see if my shield will have any effect. And as you can see here, it does not. In fact, there's no animation at all to indicate that the sword even touched my shield. And that's very odd. Further, this seems counterintuitive when we compare the Drake Keepers in Dragon Shrine to the old knights in Heights Tower. Now, from a lore perspective, I imagine they're meant to be related because when you look at them, they seem to be very similar, and in fact, their movesets are almost identical. And as you can see, the old knight in Heights Tower performs the very similar, if not same, slash attack. However, unlike the Drake Keeper, I'm completely able to mitigate it just by keeping my shield up. Also, if we keep in mind the fact that the player will encounter the old knights in Heights Tower long before they get to Dragon Shrine, then it can be reasonably expected that the player will have learned that this specific attack from a similar enemy should in fact not be unblockable. And that leads me to the dual-wielding giants in the Ancient Giant Memories. All of their attacks are completely unblockable. And while you might say that that is intuitive based on their size and, again, sheer mass, I have to disagree, because everything that I've learned in this game, including fighting the Giant Lord from the same memories, is that most of these enemies are in fact blockable, so it doesn't follow. But the bigger problem for me with these unblockable attacks is that it causes a fight that could otherwise be fun and engaging for a melee character to consider other options, and whereas I might prefer to get in with the enemy and fight with the Claymore, I'm really encouraged, because of their damage and unblockable nature, to simply stand back and spam them with lightning spears. And that's just not as much fun. And that leads me to our friend the Ironclad Knight. Now, as you can see here, even with a 100% physical resistance Great Shield, I take full damage from his attack, and I'm actually pancaked to the ground. The problem with this, of course, is that this is completely unintuitive. As opposed to the giants, we've had many examples of enemies that are larger and heavier and with very similar animations performing similar attacks that we've been able to block entirely, and that includes Velstadt the Royal Aegis. Now, I'm not saying that the Ironclad Knights are specifically hard or not fun to fight. I'm just saying that they don't make a lot of sense considering all the other examples of larger mobs with similar movesets that we're able to block successfully without taking any damage. But then the question occurs as to why the Ironclad Knights are able to completely bypass shields, and why they're able to pancake the player regardless of their physical defenses. And I think it has more to do with where you first encounter them. The first Ironclad Knight that you'll run into is in the Forest of Fallen Giants, and he acts as a barrier between the Cardinal Tower bonfire and the shortcut that the player will want to open to access the Fallen Giant boss. And that's why I think that there's an error in design philosophy when it comes to this enemy. At that point in the game, the new player does not have access to 100% physical resistance damage shields. And I think it would have been better to attach the pancake animation to when damage actually occurs from the attack. That means at that point in the game, the enemy would have still been able to fulfill his role as a speed bump. However, in later points of the game, when players can fully physically resist his damage, the pancake animation wouldn't occur, and the entire encounter would become more intuitive and make more sense. The final subject I want to discuss is that of unavoidable traps. In Dark Souls 1, traps typically came in the form of pressure plates, and once the player was aware that they existed, they could be easily identified and bypassed without taking any damage. On the other hand, Dark Souls 2 relies much more heavily on ambushes. Now, as I approach this door in Brightstone Cove, I see a large and apparently important room, but it has no enemies, and that concerns me. So as I go further in, I look up, and I'm quickly able to spot the spider ambush. And then, using magic or a bow, I can safely pick off the spiders one at a time, effectively disarming the ambush as a trap. And where there are 4 spiders, there's always one more. There he is. Okay, and looking around, I can see now that it's safe for me to enter the room and I don't have to worry about being ambushed. This is an example of a very well done ambush trap because it can be easily identified and dealt with. I want to look at this next encounter because it's one that I've seen many players point to as an example of an unpredictable trap. Now, here in the Forest of Fallen Giants, we'll run across this giant statue's sword plunged into the ground. And as we look up it, we'll see a narrow path with death surrounded on all sides, and a single hollow soldier guarding an apparent treasure. As a Souls player, I've been taught to be suspicious of any situation where the game appears to be baiting me into making myself vulnerable. So as I proceed up the ledge, I'm very aware that something here smells fishy. So as soon as I'm able, I'm going to try and get a look at my surroundings. And as I turn around, I can see where the trap's going to come from. And at that point, I'm able to target the enemy and deal with it with my bow. And because I was cautious and aware of my surroundings, I was able to avoid dying in this situation, though I did take damage from this guy. Again, there's no reason to assume that a player who is being cautious and taking their time wouldn't recognize the possibility of this trap. Of course, I also have to mention this door in Brightstone Cove Seldora, and I'll admit when I came here to videotape it, I had every intention of showing how it was in fact an unavoidable trap. But I looked at the message again that said too heavy to open, and then I looked around, and for the first time here I noticed the tell, and there is a very clear tell here. As you can see at the bottom of the door, there's sand seeping out in an animation under it, and that should be the clue that says if there's sand coming out below it, and the door is too heavy to open, then something is pressing up heavily against it, and opening the door could be bad. Now at this point in the game, I've already learned from the shaded woods and Earthen Peak that I can break destructible objects with iron arrows. So it makes sense now to step away from the door and shoot it to see if I can spring the trap this way. And there it goes. And I'm able to completely avoid the damage from this apparently unavoidable trap door. While I might agree that this isn't the most well-telegraphed trap, at least the developers are staying consistent by giving the player something to indicate that there is a trap there. So let's talk about trap chests. The first time you encounter one, you're probably going to take damage, and that's probably not the best way to teach the player. However, by this point in the game, you should be well aware that this can happen, and you should be ready to react to it, as I did here. And by this point in the game, this trap should not hit you. However, Dark Souls 2 is not without fault when it comes to unavoidable traps, which means we need to talk about this guy. As we proceed down this hallway in Aldea's Keep for the first time, the game is constantly teaching us things about the enemies in this area and the destructible terrain. The first thing the player will notice is, suspended from the ceiling in a cage, an ogre. If you attack the ogre, you'll learn that he's able to smash through the cage and continue attacking the player, as you can see from the remnants of the cage littering the floor. As you proceed further down the hall, you'll encounter more enemies, but eventually you'll come to a door that many players have pointed to as an example of an unavoidable trap. And here I have to disagree as well. Initially, this door, although it's destroyed here, is a metal door surrounded on the sides by bricks, but at the very top is an open metal grate. And through the metal grate, if you're paying close attention, you can see the face of an ogre waiting for you. If you pull out a bow or some other ranged attack, you can shoot the ogre in the face, triggering his aggression, and he'll break down the wall. If you are at range, then you are completely able to avoid the damage and bypass the trap. The problem comes after you defeat this ogre and proceed through the next door. You'll come to one final door, and this one initially will be a metal door surrounded on all sides by an impassable wall, and try as I might, I've never been able to see anything that indicates a tell here that lets the player know there's an ogre on the other side waiting to attack them. And the only way I found to trigger the trap is to lock yourself in the door opening animation, causing the ogre to attack and forcing you to take damage. And this is an example of an unavoidable attack, and one which damages the player, and I think that's very much outside the design philosophy that we've come to learn in the Dark Souls series. Compare that in the end to the door in Brightstone Cove Seldora, where, despite whether you think that the tell is obtuse and the way of triggering the trap is unintuitive, at least in this case there is a tell and there is a way to do it, and you are able to avoid the damage. With the door in Aldea's Keep, there doesn't seem to be a way to do that, and instead of punishing us for our mistakes, we're being punished because the game decided we should be punished. And that's not acceptable design philosophy in a game that tells us that we're only punished for our own mistakes. In the end, I feel that some of these issues are most definitely bugs. The strange animation deflection that occurs against some enemies, and the animation stutter that occurs with the Drake Keepers. However, some of these issues are most definitely design decisions. For example, the Drakekeeper's ability to seemingly string together attacks endlessly, as well as the unblockable damage from enemies like the Ironclad Knight, as well as the unavoidable trap in Aldea's Keep. In a game that teaches us that we're only going to be punished for our own mistakes, any time that the game decides that we're going to be punished regardless of that helps lessen the immersion and enjoyment of playing the game. It also makes us think that the game is inherently untrustworthy. And that's a problem for the Souls series, which has always made its reputation by being punishing, but at the same time always being fair to the player. As always though, thank you for your time, and I hope to see you in the next video.